Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, kushalmehra. My guests today are Josiah Neeley of the R Street Institute and Doug McCullough of Lone Star Policy Institute. And they together are the hosts of a very amazing podcast. I had the pleasure of being on that podcast. It is the Urbane Cowboys podcast. Guys, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
All right. So today's discussion is going to be the American political scene and the culture wars that have engulfed America. And as they say, what happens in America does not stay in America because it kind of percolates everywhere across the world. So just to give you guys an example, if you remember, there were school shootings in America 2-3 years ago. I mean, this particular one, I think, was the one in Florida, guys. So we had people in South Bombay, outside Gateway of India, holding up signs talking about say no to gun violence. And just to let you know, in India, it's very hard to own a gun, but we still, so just to give you guys a perspective. So the usual saying is what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas, but I can assure you what happens in America does not stay in America. It kind of affects the whole world. So Josiah, let me start with you. So as we stand right now, so first I'll request you to tell a bit about yourself, and we're going to divide this into two parts. So I'm going to start with you, and let's talk about American politics as of now. So where do you think is the American political spectrum roaming around? How's Trump doing right now?
So first, thanks for having me. So I am from Texas. Actually, both of us are from Texas, which is there's a lot of parts of America that people in other countries don't have very clear views, it's like Ohio or Iowa. Texas, my impression is people in other countries, they kind of know what that's about. I used to be an attorney. I practiced law for a while, and then I started getting more involved in policy and political issues. So now I work for the R Street, which is a kind of a think tank. I do a lot of work on energy stuff, but also other stuff as well. And I've always been fairly conservative, both socially and economically. And that continues to be true. So in terms of your question about the political environment right now, in America, I think this is true in other places, in some other places, but in America, this is really an age of political fracture. Where sometimes it seems that people on the right hate other people on the right almost as much as they hate the left, and vice versa. Same with the left, where there are people on the left who, the biggest enemy is other people on the left. So you definitely seen that. There's definitely been a fracture among the Republicans and conservatives between people who are more populist and Trump friendly, as opposed to kind of older school conservatives or Republicans who don't necessarily like certainly this Trump style, but also some of the trade restrictionism, immigration. There's some things that Trump is really big on that a lot of people who would consider themselves right of center are not so much a fan of. But at the same time, there's also people who really, really love Trump, right? Including folks who were not involved with Republican politics or the party process before. And overall, if you survey Republicans, Trump is not very popular in the country as a whole, but he has a lot of support among Republicans, even compared to prior Republican presidents. So that's kind of the situation. We can talk a little bit more about that, but I want to give Doug a chance to get in here too.
Yeah, so Doug, so obviously I'm going to come back to you guys about the politics, but also can you give everybody who's going to be listening to this podcast an idea about the culture war? So let me tell you where I'm coming from. So this is an average Indian's Twitter timeline, right? So we see some very weird images these days. We see people holding other people and they're walking like dogs on the streets in America. I'm really trying to be as serious as I can.
That's just really Portland.
So that was one side, and then we see massive protests, and And somebody like me, so, it's in the midst of COVID, and everybody obviously around the world, including my country. I mean, you guys did not have the kind of lockdowns we had. I mean, we had a lockdown, like you can't get out of the house. That's how bad we had it. So then we look at America, and then there's this culture war right now in America where for someone who's, let's say, sitting in India, they kind of get confused, like, okay, you're in a lockdown, but you're protesting. So when you're protesting on the streets, the lockdown is fine, and then you're not protesting. But if you go out and you protest about, I'm not going to wear a mask, or or let's say I have the right to start my business, you can't tell me to shut my business down. That protest is not okay. So can you explain what's going on in America? And Doug, and before that, please tell everybody a bit about yourself too.
So I guess a little bit about myself. I'm one of the directors of Lone Star Policy Institute. We're a relatively new think tank in Texas. Unlike Josiah, I didn't give up practicing law. I still do it. So my day job is I'm a international and business attorney. And I think it actually sort of brings a very different perspective, because as we're talking about things like the culture war, my existence, my day-to-day activities, I'm seeing people behaving rationally. I'm seeing people actually get along. And particularly in the business world, we come to the table to negotiate something with differences, and we're striving to get something done. And then you look at what's happening in the streets and what's happening in the media. It's like, that's a world apart from me. And I live in a suburb outside of Houston. And so, which, just for those who aren't as familiar about Houston in particular, it's actually been described as the most diverse city in America, which I think surprises a lot of people. And even in our suburb is very, very diverse. What I see on TV and what I see on Twitter is not the reality here at all. And one thing I'd point out too is, you mentioned the protests or demonstrations. If you looked at the George Floyd protests that happened around the country, some of which, and we could get into how things transpired. Some of those actually became violent in some places. But if you look at a place like Houston, which is actually where George Floyd was from, we had at one point 60,000 people in the streets as a demonstration. And there's a little vandalism and such, but it's a very different experience. And, we can talk about sort of what happens when you have 60,000 people in the streets during a pandemic, which raises some questions. But it was a very different experience here, where it was a demonstration, but it was also, to a certain degree, sort of a memorial for George Floyd, because he was from here. So, the United States is the size of a continent, and the type of things you see in Portland and places like that is not what you're going to expect to see in places, even crazy places like Austin, Texas.
So Josiah, let's start with the political landscape in America. Obviously, unlike how we have things in India. In India, we have the parliamentary system, and actually we have too many political outfits, and each and every political outfit kind of caters to a special interest group, whether it's based out of linguistic identity or religious identity, or many other things like economic policies. There are socialist parties in India. Other than a capitalist party, we have everything else in India, which is ironical. And people think, people think BJP is right wing, and little do they know that there is no capitalist party in India, political outfit. So now here's my question about the politics too. So let's expand on this. For a person looking at America from outside, it gets very confusing, because historically, and I'm going to use the Canadian example here, because in Canada, historically, the most pro-immigration group in that sense has always been the Harper, conservative political outfit. It's actually, people don't realize that about Canada, that the most vehement opposition to immigration has always been from the far left in Canada, especially when it comes to Quebec and places like that. But if you look at Harper and the voting patterns in Canada, a lot of people the immigrants have been voting for Harper and the conservatives. But in America, it has never been the case. Let's take the Indian diaspora in America. For that example, I know overwhelmingly, I think more than 85% of Indians actually vote for the Democrats. And now the Republican Party stand is very confusing. Even I'm not able to nail down what the Republican Party stand is per se when it comes to immigration. I remember the George Bush administration was very pro-immigration in many ways. And now you have a sudden shift of policy, especially with the latest episode, which surrounds, I think there were two issues where one was the H-1B visas and the other was students being told to go back. And I think there were a couple of, I think there are 3 universities that are kind of suing the Trump administration, or they've gone to court with that in that case. But here's my question. So for someone to understand American politics, what is the average Republican Party view? Because since the advent of Trump, you seem to have this this policy confusion where things are all over the place. Like the old Republican Party was kind of predictable on many things, but with Trump coming in, so has Trumpism? So my question to you is: has Trumpism kind of overtaken conservatism?
Yeah. So there's a lot there, and obviously immigration as an issue has changed a lot in terms of the politics of it. It used to be that the parties were more split on immigration. So there were definitely always a lot of Republicans who were skeptical of immigration, favoring restrictions, that sort of thing. But there were also a lot of Republicans who were, you mentioned George W. Bush, who were more favorably disposed, and on the left of center, you had a lot of folks that were more skeptical. Union folks. Bernie Sanders actually traditionally was pretty skeptical of immigration, and that's kind of shifted for various reasons. I think you kind of like over time, political coalitions change and the issues that are important to people change. I think, there is a general sense that that globalization has had a lot more negative consequences than people would have expected or thought maybe a couple decades ago. And I think that may explain some of what's going on with the appeal of Trump. You do have to remember, there have always been Trump-like figures on the right within the Republican Party. Back in the 90s, there was a guy, Pat Buchanan, who he ran for president a couple times, challenged the first George Bush presidency for the nomination. Didn't win. But if you look at what he was talking about, it's pretty much all out of the Trump playbook in terms of, China, trade, immigration. These are all harmful to America. He was definitely a right winger, but he wasn't so much of a small government guy. So that has always been there. But now, over the last decade or so, that's kind of been supercharged, right? And you see this, I think, not only in the United States, but in a lot of other countries too, where you have similar sorts of movements of people who say, that they're conservative, but instead of prioritizing things like taxes, they prioritize global trade or immigration issues.
Yeah, I would say I think we're going to have a lot more clarity about what the Republican Party stands for and what sort of conservatives believe, sort of on a broader spectrum, because being conservative and Republican isn't necessarily the same thing, never has been, but particularly at this moment. But I think we're going to have a lot more clarity after the election because, there's a lot of, it's kind of interesting to go back to 2016 and think about why Trump was elected and what different people, why they were motivated to vote for Trump. And two very obvious ones was people, particularly on the right of center and even moderates, were voting against Hillary Clinton in a way that we're not going to have the same dynamic with Joe Biden. I've got complaints about Joe Biden. but the sort of visceral feelings that a lot of conservatives had about Hillary Clinton, it just is not the same situation at all. But also, at the time, we just had a Supreme Court Justice, Antonin Scalia, who had just died and left a vacancy that was basically became a reason for a lot of Trump skeptics to vote for Trump with the sort of promise of we can maintain a majority on the Supreme Court. So there was a lot of, you might say, a little bit more, dare I say, slightly more intellectual conservatives that held their nose and voted for Trump with the promise that we could at least maintain the Supreme Court. But a lot of those things just aren't at play this time around. And so when we talk about, has the Republican Party, have conservatives changed their view on immigration, globalization, and all this sort of thing, it's complicated because, I think we're going to get some clarity come November. On one hand, it's like, where's the Republican Party going? But also, I think the mix of who's a Republican now is very much changed because there's a lot of people that were very clearly Republicans 4 years ago that now don't feel at home in the Republican Party because of the way that Trump has changed it potentially. And I think that I think the way those people view the Republican Party in 2021 is really going to depend on whether Trump's reelected. If Trump loses, then I think there might be a lot of, let's just mention somebody like a William Kristol at the Bulwark. He would be somebody that would likely come running back to the Republican Party and trying to shape the future of it. If Trump wins, you may see people with sort of that, they're a little bit more, I guess what the conservatives now might say, or nationalists, whatever they call themselves, rhinos, Republicans in name only, that would actually run off to the Democratic Party. So I think we're going to get a lot more clarity after November.
See, that's a very interesting point. So actually, I have a follow-up for you on that, Doug. So are you so nativism is on the rise, let's say in America. So that would be the natural correlation for that, right? So if there are people who are now changing their inherent nature, because like I said, so the George Bush Republican was someone who was like, hey, come in here. If you're scared, please come to America. We are a capitalist society. We don't care what colors, race, religion, whatever you are. Just come in, work. We don't like taxes. We just want freedom. We want freedom to have our guns. We want freedom to say what we want to say. We don't like the government telling us what we're supposed to do in our life. And that sounds like a plan. Actually, if you ask me, that sounds pretty good. But now you have this very interesting shift where you have nativism on the rise in India, in the world, even in India. I would say it's the same scenario, but it definitely is on the rise in America. So then, Doug, in that case, wouldn't a significant chunk of the criticism of the left of Trump, where they say he gives air to these nativistic arguments, actually legitimized?
Yeah, again, I think that we're going to get some clarity come November, and the reason I say that is there's definitely a legitimate critique about Trump on sort of playing footsie with nativists and so forth. I'm not going to say that Donald Trump is a white supremacist, but there's certainly is more comfortable with certain groups that are more nationalistic, more nativistic than I would be. But I think that if I were to predict sort of the battleground for this election, I would say look to America's suburbs. We know that in rural areas, that's going to be a Republican and a Trump stronghold. We know that in urban areas, that's going to be a progressive area, and it's going to vote for Biden. The battleground, I think, is going to be in suburban areas. And the interesting thing there was, even in a red state like Texas in 2018 in the midterm elections, Ted Cruz nearly lost the Senate seat out of Texas to Beto O'Rourke, and where he struggled was in suburbs, traditionally Republican suburbs. And I think that this doesn't mean that Trump can't win, but I think that if you look at the suburbs, his views are, I think there was a lot of people in the suburbs that coming into, say, February 2020 would say, we don't like his antics, we don't like his tweets, but the economy is good. GDP is up 401k looks good. And so we just kind of, if we just don't follow him on Twitter, life's actually okay. But now that you have the pandemic, I think that a lot of that rationale has gone away. The economy's suffering. He hasn't handled the pandemic well. And so if you look at people in the suburbs, they're mostly, these are the people I live around. They're not really that political. They care about quality of life issues. And I don't think that they're, for instance, I think in 2016, there was definitely, Trump was able to, go around saying he was going to build a wall. It was very much he had a immigration push, right? It was going to be he was going to restrict immigration. He didn't build the wall. And I don't think that say immigration is what's on anybody's mind right now. What's on people's mind is they want a vaccine. They want to get back to their jobs, back to their life. And at the end of the day, Trump doesn't really have a narrative. He doesn't have a track record that says, I'm here to make your life better, more certain, predictable. I don't think that Joe Biden necessarily does, but I think he knows how to convey it better than Trump does. I see Josiah smirking. What do you think, Josiah?
Well, I have said in the past that I think the best strategy for Biden to win is to do no campaigning and only appear in public often enough to reassure people that he's not dead from the coronavirus. You just hold up the day's paper and say a couple words that, because the election is not really going to be about Biden. It's going to be about Trump, pro or con. And also, whatever Trump versus the virus, or Trump versus the protests, or Trump, whatever other crises happen in the next 5 months, because it's been a roller coaster of a year.
Yeah, so this is a very important point you raised. So there is something different from, let's say, from the first term of Donald Trump, the first election, then the second election. But let me draw what was common in both the elections. So as we were talking about offline too, that I remember very clearly just before the elections and the first elections, and I remember everybody's like, look at the polls. Hillary Clinton is going to wallop Trump. Hillary Clinton is winning. Like, I think there was like 99% of the polls, including the day the election counting was happening. And I still remember the videos where, there was this thing where in the morning they had such a nice smile on their face on CNN and MSNBC and all those news channels in America. And then as the day progressed, their faces kept on changing. And I can never get that image out of my mind of Ben Shapiro doing a live stream, laughing his ass off. And he was basically in short saying, what the hell is happening in our country? Donald Trump is going to be our president. And he could not control himself. And he was laughing incessantly on a live stream. And I remember everybody and every single poll saying that Trump's going to lose, but he won. Now, the same thing's happening right now. If you look at the polls right now, so I did go on Real Clear Politics and I tried to look at the aggregate numbers of different polls. And it's quite clear that Trump has, his numbers have gone down in COVID. So let's start with you, Josiah, now. So do you think COVID by itself is going to be such a huge factor? Like, I also get it, what Doug said, that, I don't get Trump, to be very honest, as an outsider. So when they started, he was wearing a mask. Then suddenly he stopped wearing a mask. Now again, he's wearing a mask. So the signaling, like, I'll give you an example. So when it comes to India, now people can criticize Narendra Modi a lot, but when it came to his handling of COVID, the way Modi came on TV, the way Modi addressed the nation, it actually used to calm the nation down every time Modi would come and speak to us, right? And he gave us the feeling of like that senior statesman or the elder in the house who comes and says, okay, guys, I have it under control. Don't worry about it. But obviously, the American zeitgeist is not like the Indian zeitgeist. We are culturally different societies. Like America is very individualistic where, oh, you're not going to tell me what I'm supposed to do, right? In America, it has that streak. So obviously, Trump was not going to do that. But do you think this is going to hurt Trump a lot? His constant flip-flops and his gaffes where I could not control my laughter. I know he was not really saying that you're supposed to inject those things in your body, those chemicals. But the point is, it does sound hilarious when he does, make these gaffes on TV.
Yeah, so I think there's two things. One is if you look over the world, all the different countries, and also this is true historically, but most leaders have seen their popularity rise in the wake of the COVID pandemic. Even places and leaders where, objectively speaking, you'd have to say they handled the situation pretty badly, right? A lot of people have died. There's something in times of crisis, people like to rally around a leader, and if someone can show empathy and a sense of being in charge and taking the situation seriously, they tend to go up in the polls, right? That did not happen with Trump. He did not. If you look at the first few months of the COVID thing, he did not get any bump the way that other leaders did. At the same time, he didn't go down any either. It just didn't. It was kind of weird. It didn't seem to affect anything. Now it does seem to be hurting him. It's not entirely clear to me how much of it is COVID versus how much of it is his response to the protests, because that's another thing that's going on, a big thing that's related. But in January, if you had asked me in January, I think I probably would have said Trump was likely to win because the economy was going great. And you could have said in 2016, Trump was kind of an unknown quantity. Now you could say, well, he's been president, nothing really bad has happened. Now, between the pandemic, the economic situation, which is really bad, the civil unrest, and I don't want to spoil anything, but there could be like an alien invasion or something, right? Who knows what's going to happen in the next 5 months? It's really hard to say or predict what's going to happen, but the election is totally changed, right? Everything, all the old indicators that you would use to see how things are going, I think you kind of gotta like start from scratch because it's a very different world that we're living in now.
Yeah, I actually totally agree with that. I think I was telling people in February that Trump was gonna win. I really did believe it. I don't believe that now. And short of a phenomenal gaffe from Biden, which he's capable of, I don't think that Biden's going to lose. I mean, the thing about Uncle Joe is he is a gaffe machine, but they're usually pretty darn funny. I don't think that Biden is going to do the same type of thing that Hillary Clinton did when she said that, Trump supporters were a basket of deplorables. And so then every conservative rushes out and gets a coffee mug and a T-shirt that says they're a proud deplorable. And I think that was really unifying. And I just don't see that here. I mean, Biden's got a lot of issues, but he's smarter than that. Sort of a low threshold, but he's smarter than that. I don't think he's going to make that type of mistake. And for instance, there's been a couple of different reporters that have sort of thrown a softball to Trump saying, why should we reelect you? What's your agenda for your second term? And I think the most recent one was Chris Wallace, and Trump's response was, well, I was treated very badly in the first term. Like, that's not actually, a reason to vote for you in the second term. And so I don't think he's making any case at all. And even with even if he reboots the campaign and he has a new campaign manager like he did in 2016, I just don't think he can get them. I don't think that there is a message that's going to resonate that's going to get people to look past the mishandling of the epidemic, the mishandling of the government restrictions, and it just ultimately, what Josiah was talking about, the lack of empathy. I mean, I just don't think that people are going to, have any confidence that that if we say we think that we can get our hands around this virus in the at the early part of 2021, I think most people would look at that and say I'd have more confidence that a seasoned politician like Joe Biden is going to surround himself with adults that are going to go actually do something to solve the problem. Maybe we don't like everything he's going to do, but he's going to have a plan versus Donald Trump that just seems completely adrift.
All right. So, what about this side of things? So, I'm just going to use Joe Rogan as an analogy. I'm not saying he has any kind of political influence or not. So, Doug, let's start with you here. So, Rogan has been quite clear on his podcast, and I mean, we cannot deny the fact that Rogan's podcast is the biggest in the world. I mean, Rogan's so powerful. So many Indians listen to Joe Rogan, for that matter. Yeah, he's huge in India. It's like a lot of Indians listen to Rogan too, and So, what would be Joe Rogan's not a right of center guy. He's on the left. Rogan's been pretty clear about it. And when a guy like Joe Rogan goes like, he's not sane. He can't even frame a sentence, and he keeps on harping about it on his podcast. So, do you think that this disenchantment that you talked about that people have with Trump, don't you think there is an even more significant disenchantment that people have with Biden and his basic inability to even frame a sentence? And they're like, are we going to have this guy as the president? So I might as well not go and vote.
So I think I recall Joe Rogan as being on a TV show where you ate really weird foods or something. I've never actually listened to his podcast, so I don't know what Joe Rogan's. I do know that he's got a really big Spotify contract, but there's something to that to a degree. I've kind of joked around about Joe Biden that the best thing about Joe Biden is that he's now a doddering old fool, because he's always been a doddering young fool, or younger. He's actually quite a bit older than Trump, I believe. But the fact that he's sort of empathetic, and he at least portrays himself as empathetic, and that there's sort of this expectation that he's been around government enough that he's just going to surround himself with people and probably listen to them. And if he can't really articulate a clear message, maybe, I will say this, as somebody who's right of center, if I think that Joe Biden is going to be low energy, incoherent, make gaffes all the time, and really have a hard time passing a legislative agenda, that is amazing from my point of view. If that's what, if that's the risk of the choices between, let's say Joe Biden versus a very organized, very, ambitious Elizabeth Warren, I would much rather have somebody that I think is a little bit more of a, stammering old fool. That's much more appealing to me.
Fair enough. So now let's get into the second part of our discussion, which is the culture wars. So Josiah, let's start with you here. Now, I'm not able to understand what's happening in America, and this is my conclusion. So correct me if I'm wrong. So I've had this discussion with few other folks in America. So this is my understanding of the American culture. So you had the 60s hippie movement, and you had the social changes that happened in America. You had the civil rights movement, and then from that comes a lot of things. And then maybe in the early 2000s, there was the rise of neo-atheism, and there was a significant attack before that from many years on the American essence. And the American essence was always, they had this grand narrative of American exceptionalism and the Protestant work ethic and stuff like that. And in comes this hard line secular ideology, and it clubs with neo-atheism in a very weird way, and you've kind of smashed the edifice of old school Protestant ethic in that way. And when I look at what is loosely nowadays called the social justice warriors in America, I see a new kind of religion coming up in America. It's actually very similar in many ways to the old religion, where it's just the original sin has changed, where the original sin in the case of Christianity maybe was something else. And here the original sin seems to be privilege. It's kind of, that's your original sin. And the weird thing is that in this new religion, there is no redemption. Like in Christianity, you can redeem yourself, right? You still have the option of redeeming yourself. But here you just don't redeem yourself. In the words of Robin DiAngelo, no matter what, if you're white, you're always wrong. And it's kind of very interesting to me. And in such a scenario, how are you guys still not confident when the cultural zeitgeist, where it's on your TV screens, it's on your social media streams. I don't know how big WhatsApp is in America, but like in India, these kinds of things come on WhatsApp too, and that has really downstream, percolations. But I guess in America, Twitter is enough. A lot of people are on Twitter, but how can such a huge cultural change where, like, I mean, a guy like McWhorter, who's I don't see McWhorter to be right of center. I mean, I'm sure you've heard John McWhorter is a linguist.
Yeah. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So, and then there's Matt Taibbi, and then there are many other people who have been speaking up about this, till the extent that even Sam Harris had to do a whole monologue on his podcast where he was talking about, crime. So let's take the subject of, gun violence, or let's say racism in America for that example. And there was this, I forget the name of the Harvard professor, who had come up with the research where when it came to actual violent crimes, when we check for all the variables, is actually what comes out is that actually more white people end up being killed by cops than African Americans. And Roland Fryer, yeah. So thanks a lot. So I'm very bad with names, so I did remember reading about it. So and in the same research, obviously, it was categorically stated that cops do tend to mishandle African Americans far more for petty crimes, like let's say if you're having a bag of weed on you or something of that sort, the probabilities of the cops roughing you up and being harsher on you and tend to be more in those cases. So for lighter crimes, there seems to be a bias, but my question to you is that if the entire cultural zeitgeist is going to go where it doesn't matter if you're white, you're canceled, and your privilege is a sin that has no redemption, why would Joe Biden still win then?
Yeah, so this is an interesting disconnect in our politics, that the public discourse and the political battle lines seem to be drawn, as you say, between this kind of woke position that emphasizes issues of race and to some extent gender as well, and very critical, has some very strident views which traditionally would have been pretty marginal. And yet the Democratic nominee is a 78-year-old white guy who, not only is he not woke, but he doesn't even know what the word woke means, right? In fact, he released one of his campaign videos a week or two ago. He released it and he said, "Have you heard this term, woked?" So he's out of it, right?
But that's like the most reassuring thing about him.
Exactly, right. So I think this is, you asked, if these battle lines are drawn. One thing that I think protects Biden is that it's very difficult for for Trump or Republicans or conservatives to tie Biden to all this woke radical stuff, because you just look at the guy and you listen to him talk, and it's very clear that that's not who he is. It's not where he's coming from. It would be like if the left were to try to accuse Donald Trump of being a religious fundamentalist, right? He's a fundamentalist Christian. He's gonna. It doesn't stick. So I actually think in that respect, it makes the political discussion a little weird regarding the election, but it's probably to the advantage of the Democrats that they have a candidate like that who is harder to associate with the more radical elements that might turn the voters off.
So Doug, here's my query then. So on one side, we're saying basically Joe Biden is Uncle Joe, kind of out of sorts, Uncle Joe who doesn't know what's going to come out of his mouth in the first place. So then, but why can't the Republicans actually send a message out to the base and maybe the independent voters who have not yet decided that, listen, this guy is out of sorts anyway, so I don't think so he's going to be running the presidency. So who's going to be running the presidency is very important. Who's going to be doing the policy? Is it going to be the squad? And obviously, for the folks who don't know, the squad is this lady from New York, and then there is Rashida Tlaib, and there is Ilhan Omar, and then I forget the fourth one. But basically, they're there, and then there is Nancy Pelosi playing poker on the side. So, some days she likes the squad, and then the other days she's putting the squad down. And I mean, I have to say, she's a wily old politician. She knows how to play politics. I have to give it to her as someone who follows politics very passionately. So she's smart that way. But the point is, then, shouldn't the Republicans be saying, look, Sleepy Joe, as Trump likes to call him, it's a hilarious name, I have to say, but Trump calls him Sleepy Joe. So Sleepy Joe is not going to be the president. He's just going to be the president as like a rubber stamp president. And these are the people who are going to be actually pushing your policy. So why aren't the Republicans doing that?
So there's a few problems with that. First off, pointing to Biden's potential intellectual disabilities is probably not a smart play for Trump. And then if you think about, the idea of, well, you have to really think about the people that the president would be surrounding himself with. That's not going to be a strong suit for Trump either. I'm currently reading John Bolton's book, and it's hilarious because he's giving all these insights about what chaos there was in the White House. And of course, it's part of the reason it's so funny is he's casting aspersions at everyone else, and like you're doing exactly the same thing. But the idea that, well, we really need to know who Biden's going to surround himself with. Well, we don't know, who's going to be in the current White House, a month from now. Normally I could probably name the most of the people in the cabinet. At this point, I've given up. I barely know who's in the cabinet anymore. But I would also, at the risk of being glib, I would also say this, that despite all this talk about the culture war, and I'm not saying that it's not real, some of what's going on is the fact that, we're in an election year, so people are trying to make things more divisive and more contentious. We're also all in isolation, so we have nothing better to do than to sit around on Twitter and amplify all this. But I also think that the moment that Joe Biden is sworn in, it's going to be all rainbows and ponies for everybody. It's going to be a new day, and suddenly systemic racism is all going away because we have elected Barack Obama's vice president. And sure, there's still going to be a lot, this is their mission, whether they're in a think tank, whether they're an activist, they're still going to be concerned about all these same issues. And I grant them that. But in terms of the dominant culture, I think the conversation is going to change dramatically, sort of in that honeymoon period. If Joe Biden is actually elected, we're going to be looking to him as sort of a mini messiah, that he's going to bring a new day for us all.
If I could just add something to that, which is Joe Biden has not announced yet who his running mate is going to be, who the vice president is going to be. That should be coming soon. I suspect that once that happens, particularly depending on who that person is, he said it's going to be a woman, likely to be a person of color in one respect or another. I suspect that there will be a concerted effort to try to argue that this person is going to be the real president, right? She's going to be the one who's really in control. And depending on who he picks, the vice presidential candidate may be someone who is easier to tie into some of the more radical stuff. So perhaps they're holding their fire for that reason.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I did see that Nikki Haley had essentially tried to play this game where she basically was saying, that no matter who Biden picks as a running mate, whoever's in the cabinet, that the person who's going to really be directing policy is Elizabeth Warren. So they're already sort of trying to play this game. At least Nikki Haley, as a proxy for Trump, is trying to play this game.
Well, that's interesting. So now let us leave the elections and the politics aside. Now just let us look at American culture on a whole. And this question is for both of you, and I'm going to start with Josiah, right? So Josiah, do you think a certain section in American society, I'm not saying in the American society at large, but do you think there is a crisis of meaning there? I think somewhere down the line, and it's funny coming from me because I'm a godless guy myself. Yeah. It's actually very weird. Every time, I talk to religious people and they'll be like, "Are you sure this question is something that you really mean? Because you yourself are very materialistic in your own ways." But I have always been one of those, and I'll explain where I'm coming from. I have never been someone who believed to throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you know what I'm trying to say. And somewhere, I think a huge chunk of American life, they have kind of thrown the entire edifice of religion. And now they're like, I hate it when the neo-atheists or anti-theistic people tell me that, oh, meaning is so simple to get in life. You can get meaning in music. You can get meaning out of football. I was like, are you trying to say religious people don't enjoy music and football? Are you that silly? Yeah, I was like, what are you trying to say? I was like, that's not a good argument. So do you think America is having a crisis of meaning in some ways? And this is for both of you. So Josiah, you can go first and then Doug can come in.
So that's definitely plausible. In the United States, traditionally has been kind of weird in that for a rich, developed, technologically advanced country, we were still pretty religious, right? So whereas if you look at Europe or Japan, most developed parts of the world, church attendance was fairly low. In the United States, we tended to be much more religious. And over the course of the last decade or two, that's really fallen off, particularly among the young. And so I think that is an important insight, that perhaps people are trying to replace the meaning that they would have gotten from religion with something else, whether that's woke stuff or political activism, so on and so forth. I don't think that's I am not convinced that's the biggest or strongest factor, just because for various reasons. But there's, you mentioned that earlier, you kind of said that wokeism was kind of like religion, but without redemption. While there are some definite similarities between the kind of woke ideology and religion, it doesn't seem to have any of the consolations of religion. So, and it seems to have come on really rather quickly in a way. It's kind of, I guess that does happen with religious revivals too, but I don't know. So I definitely think, a large part of what's going on now is kind of an attack on civic meaning. So you look at like tearing down the statues or projects that attack the national narrative, national myth, identity. So that, if it really is a crisis of meaning, that's probably a worrisome sign, because you end up destroying more meaning, and who knows what could emerge from that cauldron there.
Yeah, it's a difficult question, and I think that my views on it are probably pretty similar to Josiah's. I do think that people are misdirecting a hunger for some type of meaning and being part of something, and trying to find that in politics, and I think that's always a mistake. But I also think that there's an element of we actually have, and you could put too fine a point on this, but I think that we have done so much to improve the quality of life in America. It was true before the pandemic, but I think it's even more true while we're sitting around literally with nothing to do, that we're sort of bored and we're looking for something to be angry about, something to give us meaning, something to be against. And when the economy is up and employment is up and wages are on the rise, you want to have something that get you motivated. And, it's not like I'm old enough to remember the Cold War. So we had an enemy. We had somebody that would be like, we could all rally around America because we had somebody that was sort of this force of evil. And there's not really that type of situation anymore, although I think there's an opportunity there for the taking. If somebody would be bold enough when it comes to China, they probably could make the same case, particularly when it comes to the treatment of Uyghurs and such. But there's not that unifying sense of identity of we're all Americans, we believe in freedom, against those people out there that believe in just the opposite of us. There's not that, and I just think that we're sort of looking for meaning, and too many of us are looking for meaning in the wrong places, which is politics.
Yeah, that I totally agree with you. And this is going to be my last question before we wrap things up, because I'm conscious of your time. The one thing that has always attracted me about the United States of America, and this is why I always say, while I love my time in Canada and I have very fond memories of there, but I always say one thing to all my friends in India whenever they ask me, why do you think America is the greatest country today in the world? And I say, because that's the only country in the world where people actually have freedom of expression in the real sense. I mean, ask a guy who lives in India. I can rat out laws after laws where, believe me, like as a good friend of mine and who comes on mainstream media in India a lot, Dr. Anand Ranganathan, he says the only reason I'm not in jail right now in India, and he's an atheist, is because the Indian state has decided that he should not be in jail right now, because there are laws in India, like, there is a blasphemy law there. And the funny part is India is majority Hindu, and Hinduism does not even have a concept of blasphemy. Like, we don't even have it in our religion. And we still have a blasphemy law in this, in this country. I mean, that's for another day. But what worries me is when I read op-eds, in pretty decent magazines and mainstream outlets where, slowly but surely, like the recent letter about cancel culture, and even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I know somebody will say, oh, who is she? She's just a senator or whatever. She's from New York, and she's from just one section of New York where she hardly is representative of America. But what worries me is that there is a voice now in America that actually says maybe free speech, and that includes hate speech, because American Supreme Court judgments have been very clear that even hate speech is free speech. It's not like I like hate speech, but the point is that's the price you pay. And that's what I loved about America. And I would always tell my friends, look, that's what we should aim for. Brandenburg versus Ohio State. That's the standard we should go for. And that is being challenged, Josiah. Should we be worried about that if we were looking at it from outside? Is there a threat to free speech in America?
Well, I am worried about it. It does seem so. From a strictly legal perspective, free speech is probably about as protected as it ever has been. So if you don't need to be worried about armed officials coming to your house and taking you away because you said something critical of the president or you said something that was politically incorrect. Which is not the case in many other parts of the world. However, culturally, there does seem to be a bit of a chill that has fallen on free speech, where there are an increasing number of topics or positions or viewpoints that are considered unacceptable. And if you say the wrong opinion or even use the wrong phrasing, you can lose your job or be ostracized. And so there's been a bit of a narrowing. And in addition, not only has there been a narrowing, but it's also important that some of the unacceptable opinions, in my opinion, are perfectly reasonable. So that's even worse. It's one thing if you're restricting, you're culturally restricting speech and it's all bad. But it's in this case, it's not all bad. So, there is there's a woman, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is the inspiration for a big project in the New York Times called the 1619 Project, which is all about trying to redefine the foundation of America as being based on racism or whatever. And she tweeted something recently about how she thought it was funny that people would claim that things like the New York Times or universities or whatever were woke because they didn't live up to her standards of what she would like to see, right? So there's already, I think, a bit of a problem with free speech. And what worries me is there are a lot of people who would like to see it go even farther, right? And they might get their way. So, which, worries me both for self-interested and civic-minded reasons, because, the thing about, one of the things that I like about capitalism and democracy and the common law legal system is they're all based on they're adversarial systems, right? They're based on competition, whether it's ideas or businesses or whatever. You don't just assume that you got the right answer. You assume that people come to the right answer by having one person say something and then someone else contradicts them, and you kind of try and sift the arguments pro and con. And when you lose that, you lose an enormous amount of human potential and the potential for progress and advancement. And I don't want to lose that.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with Josiah on the legal side of things, and I think the concern is much more in the cultural space as well as in the corporate space of how corporations are responding to outside influences, activists, and so forth. But I don't think that that's a lost cause. I'm not an expert in this at all. I'm not even an NBA fan. But for instance, I know there's a big issue when the general manager of the Houston Rockets dared to say something in favor of Hong Kong, democracy in Hong Kong, and it sounded like half the NBA came jumping down his throat about, well, we don't really know what's going on in China and Hong Kong. And so basically there's sort of now this uniform approach of the NBA is all standing together, sort of nobody can say a word in favor of Hong Kong democracy. And the allegation is because there's too much Chinese money at stake for the NBA. That type of thing is definitely worrisome. But in terms of the legalities of being able to speak, you certainly have the ability to speak. And even in the case of like that corporate situation, again, I'm not an NBA fan, but if I were an NBA fan, I think I would have just immediately stopped being an NBA fan because of that, right? So you have the ability to say, you know what, this behavior is completely out of line. I'm not spending another dollar with the NBA. I'm not spending another dollar with Nike or whoever else advertises with the NBA. And that's not a perfect way to respond to things, but at least it's a way. And so to the extent that it's outside government, outside of like government censorship, there are ways to push back. And, if you see speech by the NBA, individuals can speak up and say, no, if you're going to tell me I can't say, support democracy in Hong Kong, I'm going to say support democracy in Hong Kong even louder, and I'm not going to buy your product. So we still have all of those means in our society. And so in that sense, I think that as long as people are willing to, use their speech rights, is if the minute that you actually feel cowed, that you feel like you can't speak up, you're already sort of conceding defeat. But when somebody says something outlandish and you actually respond, you don't have to do what I think that Donald Trump and some other people on the right go too far, and they want to say something even more shocking because they want to get your attention and they want to own the libs, so to speak. You don't have to do that, but if you simply respond and say what you just said is irresponsible, it's wrong, you're supporting a dictatorship, whatever the case may be, but you actually voice your opinion and you do it boldly. You don't even have to be angry about it, but if you just keep exercising your own speech, I think that's one way to push back at any of the forces that are trying to rein in free speech.
Yeah, I kind of hear you, and it's very interesting because I think, and we can wrap things up now, but I just wanted to get your opinion on this, Doug. That so, what do you make of the whole Colin Kaepernick thing, right? So, isn't that also in a way a challenge of free speech, where he kneeled down on the national anthem, him kneeling down, and then he doesn't get picked up? I mean, so I do hear in a lot of Republican or conservative circles, oh no, he's not a good quarterback. Look at his averages. In the after the first year and a half, other than that, his average was going down. That's the real case why he's not being selected. But don't you think there must be some tiny little angle that a lot of conservatives and Republican supporters, or in general, are huge followers of NFL, and they don't want to see people kneeling down or stuff like that? So isn't that also a case of the same thing? And then you have LeBron James, who just refuses to make he doesn't speak a word on China. LeBron James, somebody went on, I remember his reaction was like, what, China? There's something called China? I don't know what China is. And to me, it's actually, don't you think it's the same thing playing in both cases, Doug?
Oh, honestly, I don't know, because Colin Kaepernick actually, it did seem to like he was already kind of past his prime. I think that already so I don't want to get into the where he stands as a quarterback, but you certainly can say he wasn't, from what I saw of it, he wasn't as sharp of a quarterback as he was in earlier days, but also undeniably he was going to bring drama to a clubhouse. And in the sense of, if Tom Brady wants to say something highly confrontational and bring a lot of drama, you put up with it because you're going to win. But if somebody is going to be even an average quarterback, you're not going to put up with a lot of drama. And I think that on the flip side, we could talk about Tim Tebow, who actually, got as far as, I think, winning an actual playoff game and so forth, which Kaepernick previously had done more than that. I think he played in a Super Bowl. But, Tim Tebow, takes a team to the playoffs and is out of the NFL too. And, I guess a conservative could say, well, there was, because of, him preying on the field so much, there was, discrimination against Tim Tebow. We're all entitled to our opinions. I don't know how to rate Colin Kaepernick. There certainly would have been a ton of drama. And again, it's to the extent that this is sort of the marketplace and people say, I don't want to watch that product because he's doing something offensive to me. That's all part of it. They're free to have that reaction. Probably if they really are an NFL fan, if they're going to be offended by that, it's probably smarter just to fast forward and not watch that part of the game. But that's all, that's not, I don't have as much concern about that, because that's not the government telling me, you have to stand up for the flag, or you are setting a rule. People have their own remedy. They have their own remedy of like, I'm going to watch this game in support of Colin Kaepernick. I'm going to turn off the game because I'm offended by Colin Kaepernick. And to me, as long as we have the freedom and have a remedy to make our own choices, then I think the situation is manageable.
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes as a sports lover and, somebody who enjoys sport, and actually nowadays I'm obsessed with mixed martial arts, and that's all I watch. I just watch UFC all the time. And I just hope sometimes just sportsmen just talked about sport. I know it's very weird, but
right.
Just don't talk about politics, man. I just liked you when you were just a sports star. Just let me have my in a way to use woke language. That was like a safe space, right? Where it doesn't matter which political ideology you belong to, and you just go and you enjoy the sport and you get out of there. And I don't know, I just think politics sullies everything, and I wish that sport and politics would not have mixed. But I think we are in the way, we live in the age of hyper information, and I don't know, social media has just in a way has just made us crazy, where we just want to have an opinion on everything. I just wish we could go back to those days where somebody would come and ask me that, hey, what's your view on this? And I'd say, I actually don't know. And I don't care. Yeah. So guys, once again, thanks a lot for coming on the podcast. I really enjoy your podcast, for at least for someone who's living in India, and I like American politics. I think and I always maintain this. There is this chauvinistic side even in Indian politics, but at least I don't think. I think America is a great country, and it's an ideal in many ways, and I think we can learn, as India can learn a lot from America. I'm sure America can learn a couple of things from India too. But yeah, you guys are doing great work, and once again, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, guys. So if you want to know more about the Urbane Cowboys, please check the description of the podcast. I have, kept the link of their SoundCloud, Stitcher. They're on all the audio platforms. So if you go and listen to them, you can go anywhere. If you're on Spotify, I'm sure you'll find them everywhere. And if you like what I'm doing over here, you know the drill. Subscribe to the channel, like, share, and if you want to go to the next step, you can become a member of the YouTube membership program, or you can support me on Patreon. The link is patreon.com/Cārvāka. Until then, I'll see you next time. Namaste. Take care. Goodbye.